Another motivational verse. Turn to 1 Chronicles 28. We're going to read verse 9. We're not talking about 1 Chronicles, obviously. Come on in, fellas. Grab donuts and coffee and books on the table. 1 Chronicles 28, verse 9. This is David. He's in the process of handing over the reins to Solomon. He knows he's going to die soon. He knows he's not going to build the temple. He's turning it over to Solomon. God's made it clear that that's who's going to build it. But the advice or the charge to Solomon is very much worth our reading. We're only going to read one verse of it because who wouldn't want to tell this to their son, and who wouldn't want this to be true of them as they live the Christian life right now as a Christian man? So 1 Chronicles 28, verse 9. Who's there? Mitch, are you there? Not yet. Who's it? Darren's there. Can you read in strong English for us, Darren?
Strong English. NIV? Okay.
That's fine. That's fine. Nearly inspired version.
Okay, very good. And you, my son Solomon, acknowledge the God of your father, and serve him with wholehearted devotion and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches every heart and understands every motive behind the thoughts. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever.
So what stuck out to me in those verses that apply to us, hey, can we grab a chair for Mr. Simpson? Look in the classroom back there, Tim. There's some back in there.
Some on stage.
There's some on the stage. The point of me reading that was, so he's saying, Solomon, my son, he's about to hand everything over. He says, know the God of your father and serve him. That's part of what we're doing here. We're trying to know God so that we can serve him. We're not here just to get smarter. We need to know God so that we can serve him. Serve him according to how he's laid it out. And then he describes how we need to be knowing and how we need to be serving with a whole heart and a willing mind. That this is not just mind level stuff, but that is critical. If you don't have the right thing in your mind, you can't actually function. But that it's whole heart and a willing mind. Why? Because the Lord searches all hearts and understands every plan and thought. So that's part of why what we're doing here is along those lines. To know God and serve him, because we can't serve him correctly if we don't know him, and then to do so with a willing heart, or with a whole heart and a willing mind. So just came across that verse and reading this week, and I was like, man, that's exactly what we're trying to do on Thursday mornings. So let's talk about it. We're talking about Genesis 12 through 50. Now this morning is going to be a little bit more like what the rest of our mornings are going to be. It's 38 chapters, and that's pretty typical. Or if you averaged out the rest of the books of the Bible, excluding Psalms, we'd be right around in that range. So this is going to mean we're going to be cooking. So there's a lot of good questions that I know that guys already asked me about theophanies, about what's going on when the three men come to Abraham when God's going to demolish Sodom and Gomorrah. There's a lot of good questions. So like we said last time, ask them. But if we can't get to them, no, it's not because the question's not valid. It's because we just don't have the time. We're trying to get everybody just the major tent poles of the Old Testament and then hit the main thread going through each book, which is really just redemptive history, right? The redemptive historical context of what we're trying to do. So feel free to ask those questions, but know that we may not get to them, even though they are important. The other thing that I want to do, now that we're kind of in the big meat of the book, 12 through 50, is what I want to do kind of every week is looking at each book of the Bible and seeing where there's an uncommon truth about God. I feel like there's a ton of that in the Old Testament where God just does something and we're like, yeah, how come that's not in the Sunday school curriculum when you're a kid and you're going through the Old Testament? But just an uncommon truth about God that you just would not know about him as clearly if we didn't have an Old Testament. So that's what we're going to try to end on that every single week. Not really talk about it a whole bunch, but just say, hey, read this, let's look at it. Isn't that peculiar? And chew on it on your way to work. So that's what we're going to be doing this morning. So we're going to begin with Genesis 12. So this is just an easy outline of how to understand 12 through 50. That you have three main characters going throughout. And we're going to kind of go in those big chunks. So 12 through 23 is Abraham. 24 through 28 is Isaac. He gets shortchanged. He only gets 4 chapters. Genesis, and then 29 through 50 is Jacob. He somehow steals the show, being the liar. So what we're going to look at, we ended last week in Genesis 11, and what did we conclude at the end of those chapters? What did we say? What's still going on as far as humanity? still the same, right? That we're still sinful. We go through all this stuff, created perfect in the garden, fall. God still is gracious, extends to them a covenant promise in Genesis 3:15. That's our first tent pole of the whole Old Testament, Genesis 3:15. And then they don't get any better. There's a murder, then they have a new son, and then God wipes the planet clean, starts over with one family. That guy gets drunk, then his son sins, and then we end up with men sinning all together. So the problem is still not fixed. We still haven't figured out who is going to be the seed of the woman, the offspring of the woman, to crush the head of the serpent. And we've also been looking globally, right? In Genesis 1 through 11, we're looking at everybody on the planet. Because the Tower of Babel, everybody on the planet is around that. They're just making a massive metropolis, what they're doing, because they care about their name and not God's name. And God's dealing with the whole of everybody. Adam is to represent to everybody God, and Noah's supposed to do the same thing. They both fail at that. And then now everything is going to shift. In Genesis 11 to 12, at the end of chapter 11, you see really most of all of chapter 11, you see a lineage that just goes through. And this guy, and then he did 120 years. And this guy, and in 30 years, he had this son, he fathered, and he fathered, and he fathered. And then you end up with the last guy on the list is Abram. That the lineage goes all the way down, and then chapter 12 picks up, and we're not going to look at anybody else on the planet except for Abraham and his family. That's a significant shift in the book of Genesis. We were dealing with the whole globe, all of humanity. And now God's saying we're ignoring the rest of humanity, and we're going to see other people are out there if you go through the rest of Genesis, and we're only going to focus on and write about one family. One guy with one wife who has one kid. There's a mess in between. And then one guy, and then one wife, and then one guy with a bunch of wives. So we're going to follow through. So in Genesis 12, the covenant metastasizes is a bad word. Expands, grows in a good way. The covenant expands, and we get our second tent pole. So remember, Genesis 3:15 was the first one. And what's the gist of Genesis 3:15? Anybody got that? What happens there? What does God promise in Genesis 3:15?
Christ will come.
Christ will come. We read that. What is the specifically the words he says?
From the seed of the woman.
The seed of the woman, what's going to happen?
Crush it.
So evil's going to be dealt with forever by the seed of the woman. Not the seed of a man, but from a woman. So we have a virgin birth there, and we have one individual. And then we have promised strife between Eve's lineage and the serpents. So that's good. That means we're not together with Satan. That we're in enmity with him. So he promises that, but that's all we have is a bare promise. But then, as far as like numbers of chapters, relatively quickly, we have the second huge promise. The next one's not going to come for a long time until 2 Samuel chapter 7, and then the next one's even further away in Jeremiah 31. But these come really close together. That's God's grace of saying, hey, I'm going to fulfill this. Here we go, right here. Like 9 chapters later. So let's look at 12, 1 through 3. Somebody read that. Genesis 12, 1 through 3 with a loud and clear voice.
The Lord said to Abram, "Go out from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. With all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you."
In those 3 verses, that's what we would call the Abrahamic covenant. The beginning of it. We're going to get an expansion in chapter 15, and then an expansion in chapter 17. It gets more clear, more defined, more thought out. But this is the beginning of it. This is the second major tentpole of the whole Old Testament. And there's 3 things that God promises him in there. That are going to get restated to Isaac, restated to Jacob, and then you see kind of trickling out throughout the rest of the Old Testament as God's covenant people now exist. But these 3 things are still there. What's the first thing you see in there that he's going to promise him?
Great nation.
Great nation. That's one of them. What else?
Land.
Land. What else?
Bless you, bless those who bless you, and curse you.
Right. blessing, right? So one way to look at it is that he promises a place, a people, and ruling. Or you can say land, offspring, and blessing. My particular preference is land, offspring, and blessing. But the rule comes from the blessing, right? God says, I'm going to be over you, and I'm going to bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Meaning I'm the authority in the room. But it's still his rule, which means they're going to be prosperous or they're going to fail, whether or not they're submitting to God's rule and partaking in God's blessing or not. And he's going to make them a people. So the nations, like Darren pointed out, he's got to start with at least one. Got to have one kid. And Abraham has none right now. But that's his plan is for the nations. And there's a place, a literal place, the land of Canaan. So as you go through the book of Genesis, as you study on your own, always keep looking for those things popping back up. When it talks about a physical land, it talks about an actual son, it talks about blessing or prosperity or God's authority over them. Not just in Genesis, but in Exodus and in Chronicles and in Joshua and in Judges. Like that theme, that's the covenant promise. That he's going to say, there is a land, there is a people, I do have a people, and I will rule over them in my special place. And I will bless them. So this covenant is gracious because what is Abraham right at that point? According to the end of chapter 11, he lives in Ur, which is closer to Babylon, which is Babylon is not around yet. And he's an idolater. He's just a pagan. And God chooses one guy out of the whole world. One guy, you follow me. He didn't earn it. He's not worthy. He didn't say, hey, maybe there is Trinity, triune God out there. None of that. He just says, you come follow me. Talks to one guy and says, come do this. And Abraham does it. The faith of Abraham is absolutely insane. We're going to look at it as we go through. We're going to do a quick overview of these chapters and give you some points to look at. So Genesis 12 through 23 is all Abraham. So we go through a lot of things with Abraham. He gets the covenant in chapter 12. He gets it restated in chapter 15. He gets it finalized for him, in a sense. It gets kind of like rounded out completely by chapter 17. But we do see that the progression of promises is that he gets the covenant sign in chapter 17. That's where circumcision comes in. That God said, I made a covenant with you. Here's the symbol it's going to be. On the 8th day, every single baby born to you is going to be circumcised so that everybody will know you're my covenant people, that you do this thing. Because it's not something that is done by choice for the baby. The parents choose that. So it's us saying we are of the covenant people of God, and this is part of what we do. This is all Abraham knows to do. This is the only real rule he's been given to do, and so he does it. But Abraham's life is riddled with imperfection. He tries to essentially pimp out his wife twice so that he won't get killed by the king. Hey, just say you're my sister. And he does that twice. He has this whole mix-up with Lot and then Sodom and Gomorrah. He fights this war against the pagan king. His life is nuts all throughout the whole deal. And then God says, hey, I need you to sacrifice your son. He's like, throughout all this? And he faithfully does it. And then God provides a substitute. We're supposed to see that there's a substitute there. And then Isaac's story picks up. Isaac's story is brief, but it's important. And there's a lot of symbolism in it. Isaac's wife is symbolic of our faith in Christ, that we're told by a representative who this one is, the one individual who God has laid his favor on. And she's told sight unseen. She goes by faith with the representative all the way back to the one. And so we see that in their story. But his life is riddled with sin. God tells Isaac, don't give the blessing to Esau, give it to Jacob. And Isaac's plan is to ignore that. And then his wife and his younger son deceive him. So it's still riddled with sin. Same problems that Abraham had, Isaac had. There's really, in the whole Old Testament, there's no godly father with a godly son. It's kind of tragic to think about, but I think that's there because we're supposed to be driven to God as our father. Otherwise, we would all be having classes like, we're going to have Abraham classes, and we're going to father exactly like him, instead of looking to God for that issue. But these men all end up having similar problems. But the covenant is re-given to Isaac. We're going to look at that. Restated in the theophany to Isaac and then also to Jacob. So for God to just say, this is the one that I have chosen. This is the one that I have chosen. To carry on the lineage the line that's going to have the seed of the woman. And then 29 through 50, Jacob, it kind of steals the show. That's the bulk of the book. And Jacob has a long kind of history himself, trying to get married, and then he ends up taking a concubine, and then he ends up getting tricked into the wrong woman, and then now he ends up with 4 wives, and then they all hate each other, and then the kids hate each other, and it's just this big mess. Nevertheless, God still uses him. And then the bulk of the story really picks up with Joseph. Joseph kind of becomes the main figure in Jacob's story, even though we're going to see later on he's not the one who's picked by God to carry on the lineage of the seed of the woman. But that's the God's redemptive history in the life of Jacob, parentheses, Joseph, that he's going to provide for his people through any means that he can, that he will be faithful to his people in a way that he's not faithful to his brother Esau's family, even though they are still blessed, that they aren't saved in the way from famine in Egypt like Jacob's family is with Joseph. So what I want to focus on too, that's a little bit why this is here. We're going to explain this a little bit more. But thinking about the absolute unexpectedness of how God did everything. A lot of times we just take Genesis wholesale. We're like, oh yeah, like that's how it happened, and that's how it happened because that's how it happened. And that's how the Lifeway curriculum told me that it goes down. So I got no beef. But like, how ridiculous is it that he chose Abraham? How ridiculous is it that he chose Isaac and then Jacob, parentheses, Joseph, and then Judah? This is unexpected all the way through. None of it is what we would have done. So clearly, God is the one orchestrating all of this. God's sovereignty is supreme in all of this. So we live, rather, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are living in a covenant promise that already existed for Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve lived in a place that was God's place, didn't they? They were a people. What did God say to them? Be fruitful and multiply. Build the world. And then they lived under God's rule, God's blessing in the Garden of Eden. So what is the covenant to Abraham then in 12:1-3? It's just, I'm gonna reenact Eden through you over time. That we're building towards a new Eden, in a sense, to where I am the one ruling and therefore blessing and then protecting. It is in a specific place, and there is one people. Not everybody, one people. We got to see that unfold throughout all of this. So now we're going to get to the second part of Genesis to see the plan start to play out. So Abraham's life begins like 2000 BC, and then we end the Genesis with Joseph's death in about 1800 BC. So that's the timeline where we are. So let's look more at Abraham's life. Verses 1-3 we've already read in chapter 12. He starts with a promise of the land. That's the first thing in verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, not your land, your kindred, not your people, and your father's house, not his rule and not his blessing. Where are you going now? To the land that I will show you. That's the first promise, is land. And that land is a real land. And it's real for Abraham. It's real for the people of Israel. That there's a significant plot of dirt. We have to admit that if we're going to take the Old Testament literally. But also, there's a spiritual sense into where the land, Canaan, Israel, that plot of dirt, is symbolic for a coming place. There's a specific place. John doesn't say in Revelation that I mystically felt kind of my spirit floating amorphously into a different zone. No, he said, I saw a city coming down, and then we were brought into the city, and there was a tree there, and there was a river there. So we're looking forward to a specific place. That's real. And the New Testament understands that. In Hebrews 11, verse 8, somebody flip there and read that. Hebrews 11, verse 8. This is about Abraham and the land. Talking about how we're looking for a return to Edenic conditions.
11:8.
11:8, yeah, through 10.
By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, by whose architect and builder is God.
So what was Abraham looking forward to while he was living in the physical dirt? A different city. A different place. So even Abraham, New Testament says, is looking forward to the final place while he's in the shadow place, the foreshadowing place, the type place. That's what God is trying to show us through all this, that he has a return to Eden-like state. Obviously, it's going to be different. We would argue better, but that's there. That's the nature of the promised land. It's a heavenly city built by God and not by men, and that we can identify with Abraham in that same fact that we're pilgrims. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob live in tents their whole lives. An impermanent structure. Even when they are in the land, they kind of come in and out. That they live in tents. We're waiting for God's promise to be fully fulfilled. Secondly, verse 2, Genesis 12. What's the promise there? Great nation. Great nation means what? What has to happen? Offspring. There's got to be babies. There's got to be people. I'm going to make you into a great nation. We haven't gotten to the point where God takes him out of the tent and shows him the stars yet. He just says, great nation. Lots of people. I'm going to make you into a great nation. Nobody else. You, I'm intentionally making into a chosen nation. There's people there. But he says, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing to everybody else. That you will be a blessing. So in verse 2, really at the end of verse 3, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed, we could even see that God's plan was not just to have one group of ethnic people. He was going to have one group of ethnic people that were going to go to the nations. So it wasn't like God's plan changed in Matthew 28 when he says, go therefore into all the world. His plan was always for the whole world. Was always for every tribe, tongue, and nation that he sees through Abraham to the nation. And that Mosaic Covenant's going to say that too. We'll get to that in a few weeks. That's God's heart for the nations. But in that chapter 12, Abraham is 75 years old. 75 and childless. And the promise is that he's going to be made into nations. You're going to have a son. But things don't start happening that way. Look at chapter 15. Chapter 15 and verse 3. He's starting to panic. And he thinks read 2 and 3. He thinks his servant's kid's going to take care of everything. So let me read that. 2 and 3.
After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir.
So Abraham's panicking. You told me this promise a while ago. We're 3 chapters ahead now, and I don't have a kid yet. And it's going to go to my servant's kid. That's where we're going to end up, because my servant's old, and he's the only one who has a son, and my whole entourage, the whole household is going to go to him. Are you going to keep your promise? And then what does God say? Verse 4, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said, This man shall not be your heir, your very own son shall be your heir. And then he takes him outside and shows him the stars in the heavens. And then chapter 15, verse 6. It's a critical verse. What does it say?
Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness.
Have you heard that before? When? Romans 4. There you are, Keith. We were there months ago in Sunday morning. But right here, we see how is Abraham credited righteous? It wasn't when he followed. It wasn't when he said, okay, I'll uproot my family. It wasn't when he did the stuff in chapters 13 and 14 where he has to rescue Lot from this evil king. It's when he believes God's promise. He believes God's promise. He believed the Lord, and then God counts that as righteousness. It's not righteousness. but he counts that as it. So that's where we see grace through faith. And Paul used that as an example to prove that this is how God's always saved people. It's not something that's new in the New Testament. This is back to Abraham, the first guy, the first covenant person. So he has this, it's by faith that it's an important characteristic of God's people is faith. That's what identifies them, not blood, not skin color, it's faith. That's what marks out God's people. We saw that as the covenant's unfolding. And now we got to look at the rule. Look at chapter 15. God makes this covenant with Abraham for blessing. And he's going to make this agreement. Abraham, even though he's credited with righteousness in verse 6, he's still a limited human being. And in verse 8 he says, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? How is it going to happen? God's going to make a covenant. He's made a promise, and now he's going to make a visible, human-level covenant with him. You go down to verse 13, or verse 12. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abraham, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. So there's some kind of half-waking coma that he's in, paralyzed in a sense. Then the Lord said to Abraham, or Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in the land. No, he's saying know for certain. They'll sojourn in the land, and then as he goes on, I'm going to bring judgment on that nation, I'm going to bring you out of them, and he makes this covenant, but he does it in a specific way. If you look at verse 17. When the sun had gone down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and flaming torch passed between these pieces. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring I give this land. So we see land and offspring there. Again, that I will surely do this. The covenant finally comes. But where is Abraham? And we skipped over, we said that we just read the pieces. But Abraham, what he had done previously, in verse 9, he said to him, God says, bring me 3 heifers, a female goat, or a goat, a heifer 3 years old, goat 3 years old, ram 3 years old, turtle, dove, and pigeon. Cut them in half, lay each against the other, but don't cut the birds. So they cut these animals in half, and then you get to verse 17 where there's a cryptic theophany, a picture of God walking as best as Abraham can see in his trance-like state that God's placed him in. God walks through the animals. Not Abraham. God goes through them by himself. Now, a traditional covenant would have been a little different than that. Both of them would have walked through it. Jeremiah 34, just write this down. We don't have time to dive into it. But Jeremiah 34, 15 through 20, God's talking about with Israel breaking my covenant, and you would never break your covenant like this with another man. And it says in Jeremiah 34, 15 through 20, that the reason you would cut animals like that and tear them in half, and then you walk between them with the guy you're making a covenant with, is that you're saying, if I renege on my side of the deal, may it be done to me what was done to these animals. That was kind of the ancient Near Eastern symbolism that was placed there. We know that from Jeremiah 34. But in Abraham's case, he doesn't get up off the ground. He's in a coma. So what is God saying about that covenant by doing it all on his own?
It's one-sided.
It's one-sided. What does that mean that it's one-sided?
Everything depends on God. That man has nothing to do with it. We're the recipient of his grace, and it's all issued from his mighty hand.
Right. But it comes to him. We'll see that there are conditions that God says later in the Mosaic covenant, keep my law or you will be cursed. But he doesn't say, keep my law or I will break the covenant with you. He says there will be consequences. And so it's very fatherly and less contractual. Because a father would say, if you do break my rules, then I'm going to punish you, but you're never going to not be my son. And that's what's going on with Abraham. He's saying that you're going to sit here. I'm unilaterally making this. So it doesn't wholesale depend upon you. Blessings depend upon you, but the covenant rests on me. So then he's therefore, in a sense, also assuring that Abraham's lineage will always continue. that redemptive history will continue on, because if they totally fall off and they totally go away, then God's made a covenant with no one. But he's saying, I'm going to do this, and therefore I'm assuring that there will always be a remnant of faithful people. I am making sure that regardless of how sinful this entire family gets, as they explode in growth, we'll see in Exodus, there will be faithful people still. I will see to it that I will still be in covenant with you, regardless of your rebellion.
Can I bring up something? The Trinity.
Right.
Okay. The covenant within the Trinity, possibly, that, the Word, the Jesus, the preeminent Jesus, was given. We are His.
Right.
All right. And He is our representative. Perhaps the covenant is within the Trinity, that God the Father is making a covenant with God the Son in that instance, even though they work together and have like mind, that it's representative of that. What do you think about that?
Well, sure, we do see that in the New Testament that God does promise to give Jesus a people for his own possession, that he is presenting a bride to his son, and much in the same way that Abraham wanted to present a bride to Isaac. But I would take this literally as a covenant between Abraham and God. But
given what you said about him walking through the symbolic
right.
whole east, whatever. Anyway, that's my point.
Right.
So,
Yeah. That's good. So now, for the sake of time, we got to move to Isaac. So Isaac comes. We're in 24 through 28 now, and we're going to see the covenant re-given to Isaac. So Isaac in, make sure I find my spot. Where did I write it down? It's in 26. Yeah. 26, verse 2. Somebody read 2 through 4.
And the Lord appeared to him and said, Do not go down to Egypt, dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all those lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed.
So there we saw all three things, right? Blessing, offspring, land, God's rule over them. It's all there again. And what does it say in verse 2? And the Lord appeared to him. Abraham has this theophany of the smoking fire going through. We have another theophany. Theophany is a word that doesn't appear in the Bible, but we use to describe a seeming appearance of God on earth, like when Moses sees his back, things like that. That's what we would call that. So Isaac has that as well. So that's beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is going to Isaac and through Isaac's family and not Ishmael's. While God is kind in a sense to Ishmael, he does not appear to him and restate the covenant. He appears to Isaac and restates the covenant to him, showing his choice of Isaac. And then Isaac's family history, it's pretty brief. As we go through it all, we end up kind of the main thing that goes on in Isaac's story is when his sons become adults and they start just causing all kinds of havoc. And we see that God says to Isaac, I am choosing the younger, I am not choosing the older, opposite of everything that a Near Eastern culture would do. That we would never pass over the firstborn, especially if the firstborn is strong, is mighty, is very manly, is a hunter. You wouldn't pass over him for the guy who likes to cook and has smooth skin and is a liar and kind of deceitful. But that's who it goes to. And we see that in Romans 9:10 through 12. Esau I have hated, but Jacob I have loved. A lot of times we get hung up on, man, how could he hate Esau? Well, the bigger problem is, how could he love Isaac? Isaac's the most unlovable one of the whole bunch. How could he have loved him? But he did choose him. This is where the unexpectedness all kind of comes from, is that why Abraham after the whole world? In Noah's day, there was at least Noah who was faithful and not turned to just pagan revelry. But Abraham, we know from elsewhere in the scriptures that he was an idolater. But God chose him over the whole world. And then Isaac over Ishmael. Ishmael's born first. His mom is lowly. His mom is of no class or repute. And that's kind of God's MO with Ruth and with Mary. But he doesn't choose Ishmael. He chooses Isaac. And then Jacob over Esau, it makes no sense. Esau's the clear candidate. Esau's the blue blood, the strong leader, the one who's going to carry on the family name. He's going to provide for himself and take care of his family. But he chooses Jacob over him. Promise doesn't go to Esau. It goes to Jacob. And then we'll see Judah. That's the craziest one of all that happens. What we just see, what God's displaying in this is that human beings have no rights over God whatsoever. That God is free to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants to. That he can choose Abram and nobody else in the land of Ur can go, it's not fair. He could just do that. He could choose Isaac over Ishmael, and Ishmael can't say anything. And God is still gracious to Ishmael and his family, and he's still gracious to Esau. Ishmael and Esau go on to make huge nations, and they have a lot of earthly wealth. Nevertheless, God chooses their brothers, and then Judah, who's not the firstborn, and who's not even the good one. He's not even Benjamin. But he gets chosen at the end. So we have to notice here that God, this is what grace is, completely undeserved. And God is showing us in the first book of the Bible that all that I do is grace. I never pick the guy who's earned it. None of these guys have ever earned it in any way, and they're all sinful. All of it. This is pure, just vintage grace. Unmerited favor. That's what grace is. And then it goes to Jacob, who it shouldn't. So now we got to pick up Jacob. Keep on moving. 29 through 50. The covenant goes to Jacob. He gets the covenant promise in chapter 35. A lot of stuff happens with Jacob. There's a lot of things. So consequently, as you're reading through the Old Testament, most of what hangs us up are side stories. So what we're doing right now, and this morning we'll end up doing a lot, is we're not touching on a lot of the side stories. I don't know, a lot of crazy stuff happens in Jacob's life and his kids. I mean, he has to work for his uncle for 7 years to get one wife, and then he tricks, and then he has to work 7 more years to get another wife. I mean, 14 years, end up with 2 wives and no money. I mean, like, this guy's life is insane. But what we need to remember is that the analogy that helps me, it may not help you, is the analogy of the Old Testament being a long, old movie, black and white movie, and a soccer game. It looks like to us in our American bottom lineism, if that doesn't matter, then you should just cut it out. We're like, no, it's storytelling. It may not be adding directly to the major plot line, but it is filling out characters for us. It is giving us a bigger picture of what's really going on in the world. We're just going through the main plot line straight across. Old Testament doesn't do that. So know that when I'm skipping over some of these things, we're not saying they're not important. We're saying that's the wire that runs through the whole thing, and then you can hang the ornaments of these other stories on it. Yeah.
So I don't know if you're going to cover this or not, but the whole wrestling with God that Jacob deals with.
Right.
I'm trying to figure out what's going on there, because it almost seems like that it's a physical individual that he's wrestling with.
Right.
And it says he holds them and won't let them go. And I mean, how does that happen? I mean, what's
Right.
going on?
So I think I've struggled with that one too, but getting some perspective from other older, wiser saints, and thinking through the wrestling with God, and that's where his name gets changed, right? And that's significant because he changes Abraham's name as a sign of the covenant, and then he changes Jacob's name as a sign of the covenant. So like I am saying this is who you are. I sort of authoritative speak in your life. So we think of Jacob wrestling with God. I believe it to be a physical individual, so some kind of theophany or maybe Christophany, pre-incarnate Christ. We would see that other places like Judges. But I would see that I'm not going to let you go until you bless me as from a position of humility, like I've been humbled in this thing, and not in like an aggressive, you owe me. So in a sense of, God, I'm not going to stop praying until you do something, but not that I'm demanding you act in response to me, but there is nothing that's going to make me leave your presence. I know who you are, and I know your character, so I'm going to stay here, and I'm not going to let you go. I'm not going to ever say, like, I'm done with you. I'm not going to let you go. I mean, not that I can keep God from doing anything, but I'm going to hold on tight, like a dad going to work, and his little kids don't want him to go. they're going to hold on your legs. Dad, I'm not going to let you go. Obviously, I could just pick you up and throw you over. But it's the love of the child for the father that I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. And so that's what I think is, otherwise, if it was a sinful posture, then God wouldn't have responded to him in the way that he did, with favor and blessing. That's my 1 second take on it real quick. So chew on it, and then we'll talk about it whenever everybody who has to go to work. So Jacob, the promise, the covenant goes to him. It gets re-given in chapter 35, verse 9. I'll just read it for us for the sake of time. God appeared to Jacob again. So he's already appeared to God. But God's already appeared to him once. But he appears to Jacob. He appears to Abraham. He appears to Isaac. He appears to Jacob. And when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him, there's blessing. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. Changes his name to Israel. Verse 11. God said to him, I am God Almighty. Not you, I am. Be fruitful and multiply. Same command he gave to Noah and to Adam. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you. There's the people. Shall come from your own body. Verse 12, the land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. So throughout those verses, 9 through 12, we see land, seed, blessing, land, people, place, rule, all throughout it. The covenant goes to Jacob, clear as day. That's who the lineage is going to go through. But then, in about 37, chapter 36 is all about Esau's nation. 37, we pick up Joseph, and Joseph becomes the main character all the way through the end. And Joseph is just for skimming through, just for sake of time, Joseph is a type of Christ. Now think about this. You have an individual who's born least of his people, right? Jesus is born least of, we'll see you, Mark. Jesus is born least of the people, right? Joseph is born least. He's number 11. He's down the line of all the sons. And all of Jesus' people hate him. All of Joseph's people hate him. What does Joseph do that get hated? He's faithful to his father. He's faithful to God. Like God told him, this is what is true, and he just says that with no fear. So his family, his brother, his kinsmen hate him. And what do they try to do? Try to kill him. So they kill him. But in a sense, they kill him. They wanted to do it. Judah says, let's kill him. Reuben's like, no, my conscience is a little bit nicer than yours. Let's just throw him in a hole. And then let's sell him. So essentially, he's dead to Jacob, right? So there's a death there in a sense. And then he goes and he just suffers for forever. And then from that death, from meaning being in a hole, to being a slave in Potiphar's house, to being in prison, he's exalted to what? Second in command of the whole world, basically. And then, if you want to live when Joseph's the king, how do you live? You have to go to him. Because there's a famine in the land, and what does Joseph have? He has food. He has bread. So in a sense, Joseph is the bread of life. If you want to live, you go to Joseph. And Joseph also not only gives food to the nations, but to the faithful and repentant of his own kinsmen, he gives life, which is an exceedingly smaller number. So Joseph is a type of Christ. So typology, remember we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, that he's a picture of Jesus, of a forecoming of him, that he just keeps obeying. That's all he does is obey. And in his life, we also see the complexities of God's sovereignty and human's responsibility. Look at chapter 45. It's Joseph's story. And then look at verses 4 through 5. So Joseph, he's about to reveal to his brothers. So if you know the story of Joseph, you know that they don't even recognize him. His brothers come and beg for food. They don't even recognize who he is. They haven't seen him in decades, about 2 decades maybe, 2 or 1.5. And they don't recognize him at all. He's going to reveal to him who they are, and their response is, of course, appropriate. We're freaking out. But he says this in verse 5. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. They're responsible, right? You sold me here. And then what does he say? For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine had been in this land these 2 years. And then verse 7, And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep you alive. Keep alive for you many survivors. Verse 8, so it was not you who sent me here, but God. But didn't he say in verse 5, you sold me here? You are responsible, but God is ultimately responsible. Verse 9, hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. God has made me. And then you go to chapter 50, verse 20. So everything kind of gets hunky-dory with him and his brothers. Jacob finally comes, and they're going to be cool. Everything's going to be nice. And then Jacob dies, and now his brothers are like, now our security's gone. Dad's dead. He's going to kill us all now because he won't shame his father now. And they're worried about it, and they're freaking out. But he says in verse 19 of chapter 50, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? I don't have authority to judge you and execute you. Verse 20, as for you, you meant evil against me. You meant evil. You did evil. It wasn't like you were trying to do evil, but you ended up actually doing good. No, you did evil by sending me here. But God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Doesn't that sound exactly like what Peter said in Acts chapter 2 about the Jews who crucified Jesus? You are guilty, but God is sovereign over this. God intended this to happen. You're responsible for your sin. God's not responsible for your sin. However, God ordained this entire event, end to end. God meant your evil for ultimate good, so that many would live. Isn't that what is true of Jesus as well? God meant your evil, Pharisees, Pilate, for good, so that many might have life. Your sin, God superintends over and then brings life to many through that. God's sovereignty in the life of Joseph, that we do have real responsible for what we do, whether good or evil, but God superintends over the whole thing. But remember, at a theological level, so going back to the main thread of the story, what's at stake in this famine? What happens if Jacob's family dies? Lineage is broken. This can't come true. Because he said it's going through Abraham, it's going through Isaac, and it's going through Jacob. Now, if they all die in a famine, it's over. So it's not just like, oh, Joseph did a nice thing by saving his family. It's God preserved his redemptive historical plan by saving them. That's what's at stake in this whole deal. If they die, then the promise is gone. But then, you read through the whole book, and chapter 49, Jacob is dying. We kind of skipped over it, and we're going to go back to it. Chapter 49, Jacob's dying. He's going to bless all his sons. He brings them all in. He's going to pronounce blessing over them. Some of them get better deals than the others. But he's going to pronounce blessing over them. And you're convinced now, if you were reading the story, you'd be like, oh, Joseph's the guy. He's the only good one of the bunch. Benjamin, we don't know because he's too young to do anything. But the rest of them are all dirtbags. I mean, they started a coup to slaughter a bunch of people by having them get circumcised, and then they killed them while they were recovering. They lied. They tried to get rid of them. Judah is the one who wants to kill Joseph. Like Judah, Jewish people want to kill Jesus. And then out of all that, you're like, Joseph's the guy. Of course he's the seed. If he's not the seed, then he's the lineage. But then what does Jacob say under the auspices of God to Judah in verse 8 of chapter 49? It says, Judah, your brothers shall praise you, and your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. What is the seed of the woman going to do to the serpent? Crush his head, which is attached to his neck, with his foot, right? Bruise his heel. And what does he say, Judah? Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Like it's going to come through you. And then he goes further in verse 10. I mean, he keeps talking about Judah in verse 9, lion, like where we get Lion of Judah for Jesus. That's verse 9. But then 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. It doesn't say that to anybody else. Scepter is a sign of a ruling king. King's scepter, the king's lineage is not going to depart from Judah. And nor the ruler's staff between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. The king who triumphs over Satan is Jesus. The one that everybody's going to eventually bow the knee in obedience to is Jesus. And that's going to go through Judah. And that could not be more unlikely of a choice. Joseph's the guy who lived the right life. But he chooses Judah. Judah is a skis ball. Judah sleeps with his son's wife and then tries to reject her and not support her and her kid. Judah is terrible. But that's who God chooses. And then we see the lineage go on because David's of the tribe of Judah. Jesus has to be of the tribe of Judah. He's called the Lion of Judah in prophecy. This is where the book ends. But are they still in God's place? They're God's people. God's people are beginning to grow, right? There's a lot of, he has 12 sons and they all keep having kids and they start multiplying. But are they in God's place? How does it end? How does the book end in Genesis? In a coffin in Egypt, right? Where Joseph is. Joseph dies, he's in a coffin in Egypt, and that's where everybody is. So they are becoming the people. The nations and the offspring are beginning to grow. They could be being blessed. They're under God's rule now because Joseph has set things right, in a sense. But they're not in the land. They're in Egypt. So the covenant's still unfolding. The story doesn't end here. We have to keep going because they're not, the covenant hasn't been fully fulfilled yet. They're not there. We haven't seen evil crushed. So the book kind of ends. So we're beginning to see this all kind of unfold for us. Last thing is the uncommon fact about God. This is the bonus material. Turn to Genesis 20. I find this story to be beyond interesting about the character of God. This is back to Abraham, and Sarah with this foreign pagan king, Abimelech. He's the king of Gerar. And Abraham, he's going to tell his wife, hey, let's do that sister thing again. I don't want them to kill me. So Abraham said to Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took her. So this also speaks to the beauty of Sarah. How does a woman in her 90s still merit a king's attention? A stranger in her 90s. So that's something. He still wants her. In verse 3, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him. So now God, this is crazy. God's talking to a pagan king in a dream. Things are happening in Genesis that don't happen now. He's talking to him, and then he says, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. God steps up for Sarah when Abraham won't. Sarah, in 1 Peter 3, she is listed out as the model of a faithful wife because she just does what Abraham says. I mean, this is insane that she did that. God sticks up for her. And in verse 4, now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, so now he's going to talk to God in this dream. Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not say to me himself, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this. So he's like, I didn't touch her. I never slept with her. No, I didn't do anything. And they lied to me. They told me that you're mad at me because this is another man's wife. I had no way of knowing that. I was told it was a sister by her and by him. And then in verse 6, then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have not done this and that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. What does that say about God? The guy felt like, he, in his heart of heart, knew I chose to not sleep with her. I have not done this. He's claiming innocence. And what is God saying? The only reason you didn't sin is because I kept you from sinning. You would have had I not kept you from sinning. God's saying right here, I directly intervened in the actions of a human being and changed them. This is the sovereignty of God. This is God being God. Otherwise, we don't believe Proverbs 21, where God can direct the hearts of a king. This guy's a king. This is an uncommon fact about God, that directly intervening in a man's decision-making and him thinking, I did it all by myself, and God says, I kept you from sinning. Which goes along 2 Thessalonians 3 about the restrainer, that God has a restrainer of evil around the whole world, but that also infects individuals, because the world is made up of individuals. There we go. 20 seconds early. Let's pray.